let people in. Okay. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in our first information session on the road to COP16. Today we are addressing gender and environmental linkages through data. So thank you so much for being here. We are going to first have some overall of this session. Can you please, Minal, help us? Yes. So we're going to have an opening remarks in charge of our founder and director, Marina Lini-Rai, and also from Ciara Daniels. She's a policy specialist on gender and environmental of UNDP. Then we have 3 presentations. The first one is about the state of gender and environment data. It's going to be presented by Sara Duerto. Then the gender responsive GBF, MBSAPs, and implementation of the gender plan of action. And our last presentation is going to be by Karma Wangchuk about gender data and policies. So we can, can you please do the other slide, Minal? Okay, so I'm going to present our first panelist. So Marina Lini-Rai is a dedicated advocate for women's rights and environmental justice. She has been specializing in the intersection of human rights, gender equality, and environmental governance. She has been a pivotal in amplifying women's voices in global environmental policy, particularly through her leadership in Women for Biodiversity and in the CBD Women Caucus. And Ciara Daniels, she is a policy specialist in gender and environmental in the United Nations Development Program. Ciara has been working to put gender equality at the heart of caring for people and planet. She works with countries and partners to promote women's leadership in natural resource management, close gender gaps, and accelerate women's rights in environmental action. Before giving the word to Marina Lini-Rai, I want to remind all the participants that interpretation is available in French and Spanish. So, Tina, can you please join us to make the opening remarks of this information session?
Thank you, Ale, and welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all are joining from. And I'm really, really happy to have this opportunity to welcome you all in today's information webinar that we have organized. So it is a pleasure to be here today to discuss the critical role that gender and environmental data play in shaping our world. As we face the growing challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, it is essential that our policies and interventions are informed by comprehensive, inclusive data. Data disaggregated data allows us to recognize the unique experiences and contributions of women, men, and other individuals in environmental management and conservation. Gender disaggregated data in environmental policy and action is also very crucial for understanding the distinct impacts of environmental issues on women and men. It highlights gender-specific vulnerabilities, such as women's greater reliance on natural resources for livelihoods, and their often limited access to land, technology, and decision-making processes. By collecting and analyzing gender-sensitive data, policies can be more effective, designed to address inequalities, ensure women's participation, and create targeted interventions that promote gender equity in conservation and climate action. This data is essential for creating inclusive, sustainable solutions for environmental challenges and achieving a global biodiversity and climate goal. The data is not just a tool for understanding disparities, it is also a foundation for creating equitable solutions. Without it, we risk leaving critical voices unheard and missing opportunities to empower communities most affected by environmental crisis. Today, let us reaffirm our commitments to using data as a key driver for achieving these interconnected goals. And on a last note, I also want to share the importance of this webinar today is that we wanted to contribute to the upcoming CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP, Conference of the Parties 16 session that will be taking place in Cali. As you all know that in 2022, the CBD COP adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that sets forth a global biodiversity plan to ensure that by 2030, we have actions and a vision for 2050 for living in harmony with nature. It also talks about inclusiveness, the whole of society, and also a key component of that is the amplifying and the commitment that the convention itself has set forth to addressing engagement and respecting rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, youth, women, people with disabilities. And this is further strengthened by the Target 23, which we all know as the target on gender equality. I'm really looking forward to the speakers today because this will definitely inform the COP because one key element is going to be the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. So this is a movement for us to see how these global commitments would transfer and transform national policies and planning and ensuring that the whole of society, and of course, as we keep talking about, how the world's people are women, how can they be part of the decision-making? And to be able to do that, we need to have data. So I'm super excited with all the speakers and the panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm absolutely excited and looking forward to more learnings and sharings. So thank you so very much. And Ale, back to you.
Thank you for highlighting the achieve these global targets on biodiversity and the national targets, including everyone. So now I'm going to give the word to Ciara Daniels.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much to Women for Biodiversity for bringing us together and really being such a strong leader in this space. So I'm Ciara Daniels with UNDP. And, you know, I think we're all joining today because we really know and recognize how much of a pervasive injustice gender equality continues to be a barrier to all aspects of sustainable development and one of the most rampant, tenacious, and impactful forms of discrimination and bias. 1 in 3 women around the world faces gender-based violence. Nearly 90% of the global population, men and women alike, are biased against women, and only 14 countries in the world have full and equal rights for women. So we agree that gender equality is an important goal, but as Tina was saying, accelerating gender equality is key for nature too. And we have plentiful evidence to show this, and it's really recognized and enshrined in the global biodiversity framework as well and its targets. When women's perspectives and knowledge are ignored in decision-making processes, natural resource management strategies are less likely to be effective, less equitable, more unsustainable. Gender equity, women's inclusion, influence, leadership has been proven is linked to more effective and efficient projects, more environmentally friendly legislation, improved environmental outcomes like in conservation and natural resource management and much more. And closing gender gaps in access to land, water resources, resources like farmland and agricultural input can reduce direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use while generating knock-on benefits like food security, livelihood security for whole communities. And we know all of this through experience, results on the ground, lived reality, and through empirical research and evidence, data that points us to important policy solutions, gaps to address, where resources should go. At UNDP, we're working with countries, partners like UN Environment and the Global Environment Facility to support countries on those national biodiversity strategies and action plans that were just mentioned, working with countries to ensure that they're gender responsive. So I thought this was really interesting. Last year, UNDP asked 68 of those countries that we're working with, what are your main challenges to developing a gender responsive MBSAP? And the number one challenge identified was the lack of sex disaggregated and gender responsive data, far and above the main challenge identified by countries. So maybe some of you here are not surprised to hear that. But you know, when I read this, I was thinking at the same time, though, the amount of data we have globally is larger than ever, right? We have at the national level, of course, there's national statistics and census data. There's household surveys, time use surveys, administrative data. We have official UN data, such as on SDG targets. More and more data generated every day from mobile phones, geospatial data, satellite data, density maps, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. All of this, and yet we know there are significant gaps in terms of sex disaggregated and gender responsive environmental data. So I'm really looking forward today to talk more about those crucial gaps, talk about what we already know, but what connections need to be made. We know that this is not only an issue for biodiversity work, but really needed for improved progress under the UNFCCC and UNCCD and linked areas that cover all Rio conventions and so much of environmental work, like on food, land, and water. What needs to be done at the national level, especially to ensure environmental and data needs are being met. And I hope we can explore these ideas more today and during the upcoming space in Colombia. I really look forward to hearing from all of you and the speakers today. So thank you very much, and back to you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Ciara. You have highlighted about gender is a key aspect to achieve justice and equality in the world and in biodiversity, and also to have better results in the initiative of sustainable use and better results in research. So thank you for also mentioning the data and sex segregated and gender responsible environmental data as an important input of the policy planning. And also that highlighting that is one of our main challenges. So that gives us the entrance to our first presenter about the state of gender that is in charge of Sara Duerto. First, I want to mention how we're going to do. We have three presenters now, three panelists. And please, if you have any question, you can put it on the chat on the chat, yeah, so we don't miss your questions that we're going to address after the three presentations. So given said that, I'm going to give the word to Sara Duerto Valero. She's the Regional Advisor on Gender Statistics in UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where she managed the flagship program initiative Making Every Woman and Girl Count. She has been supporting the quality, available, and use of gender statistics across Asia and the Pacific, and she leads the organization's work on gender and environmental statistics. So thank you so much, Sara, for joining us. And I'll give the word to you, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Ale and team, of course, for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here today. Just bear with me 2 seconds so I can share my screen and you can hopefully see my presentation very soon. Okay, I think you should be able to see it now. Yeah, okay,
we're looking
perfect.
at now. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'll jump straight into it. So let's just begin by looking at first why gender and environment data is important, right? So I think a key reason why gender and environment data is important is that women and men are affected differently by the environment, right? So for instance, in the context of disasters, we know because we have data that women are more likely to be food insecure after a disaster happens compared to men. Like they give up their food so that their family members can eat, right? At the same time, we also know when a disaster happens, men are more likely to participate in search and rescue operations and therefore more likely to die during this, while they perform these activities, right? So just one example. In the context of climate change, for instance, we currently have the data to know that in the more arid clusters of each country, in the clusters that experience more frequent drought episodes, in the clusters where increases in temperatures are higher, women are more likely to marry as children, and women are more likely to face teenage pregnancies, for instance. We also know that in the context of biodiversity loss, for instance, as a result of deforestation, there is a correlation between deforestation and malaria prevalence rates. And when this happens, the care burdens for women increases proportionally. Similarly, in the context of biodiversity, for instance, we know because we have the data that when fish stocks decline, women who are more likely to fish on the shore really struggle because many of them do not have boats to actually change fishing locations, while men are more likely than women to have boats. And in the context of pollution, for instance, we do know that, for instance, when water sources are compromised as a result of pollution, it is typically women in 80% of the world's households who are the ones that actually have to walk further to collect the data, to collect the water, to treat the water before consumption, and so on, right? Similarly, in the context of pollution, with all the cardiovascular and respiratory issues, this worsens women's care burdens. So just a few examples of areas where we actually have the data, right? In addition, it's important to look at these issues of gender and environment because women and men also contribute to environmental conservation and degradation differently, right? So for instance, for the countries where we have fishery data that's granular enough, we do see that men tend to engage disproportionately on more destructive fishing methods, such as trawling, such as dredging, and so on, while women are more likely to practice gleaning, right? We also know that women and men tend to engage in different employment sectors. And that means, for instance, women tend to employ disproportionately on the garment sector, for instance, while men are employed disproportionately on the energy sector, right? And as a result, they contribute differently to decision-making in these sectors, right?
Sarah?
Yes.
I'm sorry I interrupt you, but could you please speak a little bit slower for our interpreters to support also them to interpret everything you're saying? Thank you so much.
Apologies
It's
for
okay,
that.
don't worry.
Will do. Thank you. Yes, so in the context of decision-making as well, we all know that particularly when it comes to, for instance, participation in parliaments and ministerial positions and so on, women are less likely than men to hold some of these positions. And not only that, but when women are holders of ministerial positions, they are typically holders of positions around social issues like ministries of women, ministries of social affairs, but they are rarely in charge of ministries of environment, ministries of energy, ministries of fisheries, and so on. In the context of natural resource management, we also know that women and men contribute differently to forest management practices, for instance. We have this data only for a few countries, but we do see that the practices used by women and men, for instance, related to the collection of specimen or the fallowing and so on, are very different. As well as in the context of practicing agriculture, where men are more likely to use pesticides, for instance, but they are also more likely to actually manage the pesticide equipment appropriately, right? So from the data that we have in the countries where we have it, right? So again, we do have a lot of data that's currently available, and Chiara was making reference to this, but it is important that we continue collecting data for more countries and that we continue sort of like analyzing this data and using it, right? We still have pretty serious knowledge gaps. So again, why is it important that we get this data? We need this data to advocate so that we can actually change the situation on the ground, right? So that we can change the policies, so that we can make informed decisions, and so that we can keep decision makers accountable for some of the promises made, right? So this is both in the context of national plans, including the NDCs, including national development strategies, and so on, but also in the context of international commitments, such as, the SDGs, the Beijing framework, the Paris Agreement, and all the other, Rio Conventions, Sendai framework, and so on. So we need the data both at the national and the international level. Now, what data is exactly available, right? Like I've mentioned some examples, and I will not be able, because I only have 15 minutes, right? I will not be able to go through all the data that we currently have. That's good news. That means we have a lot of data. But at least I will cover the different types of data that are available, right? So first, this is the easiest, quote unquote, easiest type of data source is administrative data. Administrative data, for instance, gives us information around whether women and men participate in different types of jobs. So for instance, in the context of energy, power utilities, right? So this is the bar graph that you see here. We see, what percentage of the staff is women and how many of them get to make decisions, right? Similarly, on the graph on the right, we also have administrative data around how many women are parliamentarians, ministers for environment, ministers for energy, ministers for fisheries, and so on. Our colleagues in IUCN collect these data on women in decision-making in environmental ministries. So that's admin data. Admin data is regularly being collected, so we can always tap on that. The second type of data, which is probably the most useful data to fill exactly the gap that we want to fill, is survey data. Why am I saying it's probably the best type of data? It's because in the surveys, we can actually ask the exact questions that we want to know, right? So that gives us very, very granular data about, and I included just 2 examples here, but that we have many, many, many indicators generated from surveys, right? So for instance, on the graph on the left, we can see how women and men apply measures to mitigate fertilizer-related risks. So among those that practice agriculture, who follows the fertilizer protocols, who uses organic nutrients, who distributes the synthetic and mineral fertilizer, who considers the soil type and the climate, and so on, right? And we see quite different practices between men and women. Similarly, and this data is from Tonga in the Pacific, right? So similarly, we know that women and men use different fishing practices, and this has direct effects for environmental degradation, right? So like I was saying earlier, and we can see it here, women are much more likely to practice gleaning, while men are much more likely to practice other more intensive fishing methods, non-targeted fishing methods. So besides surveys, we also have the option to integrate survey data, go one step further and integrate it with geospatial data. So these are satellite pictures. So when we integrate, for instance, demographic and health survey data with different forms of geocovariates, we're able to see, for instance, what you see in these graphs, which is how within the same country, women in the more arid clusters are more likely to be victims of child marriage, and they are more likely to have adolescent births, right? We see similar things for women who live in clusters with higher temperatures, women who live in clusters with more frequent floods, women who live in clusters with more frequency and severity of drought episodes, and so on. Another data source that we tap on is big data. Big data comes from many different sources, right? So the example I'm showing on the screen is actually big data from Google searches, but we also look at social media data, financial transaction data, mobile phone data, etc., right? Big data is useful because it helps us fill gaps where we otherwise were not able to find this information, right? It doesn't give us very accurate information, for instance, on the prevalence of violence, right? But in this case, it gives us signals as to when violence may be increasing following different types of disasters, right? So, so we do see, for instance, from what people are Googling, whether they are being more exposed to violence and therefore more likely to perform help-seeking searches online. And finally, we do modeling and forecasting, which is a little bit more complicated, and there's a number of assumptions that need to be made, right, to look at modeling, but we are able to, for instance, forecast what's going to happen to poverty rates and what's going to happen to food insecurity rates in the context of different climate scenarios. And as a result, how many people are going to be pushed into poverty, into food insecurity, and so on. And what can we do about it, right? We're also, through modeling and forecasting, we're also able to see if we invest in gender equality, how much of these effects can be mitigated. So again, lots of different possibilities for looking at data and lots of data currently available. So what are the barriers and opportunities to fill the remaining data gaps, right? So some of the data that I showcase is available only for some countries, for instance, and some is available for every country, right? So there's a wide variety of availability of data and of quality of data. So in order to fill data gaps, one of the very important solutions is gender and environment surveys. These are surveys that are specialized surveys that UN Women is supporting different national statistics offices, so the governments can perform national surveys themselves, right? These are standalone surveys, and they cover many different topics. As you can see there, the list of modules, right? Ranging from disasters, climate change, to, like whether women and men engage in different environmental livelihoods, whether they own environmental assets, and so on. So different, and regarding disasters and climate change, they cover issues like exposure, what people need to prepare, the effects on their health, the effects on their income, on their food security, and so on. So it's a wide variety of topics. The pluses of this is that the survey is designed with gender in mind. So that has adequate sampling strategy, meaning two people of different sex within each household are sampled. It has gender-sensitive survey operations with adequate gender training for the enumerators. So it really is able to collect a lot of information on gender and the environment that it's reliable. The drawback, of course, is the cost of a national survey is not little. And also, they are pretty long surveys in the cases where people have experienced many disasters. For instance, if people have experienced 4 or 5 disasters, then we need to ask a sequence of questions associated with each of the disasters they experience. So the length of the survey increases. Option number 2 is to take other surveys that already exist, like demographic and health surveys, multiple indicator cluster surveys, any survey that has adequate sampling strategy that doesn't rely on proxy respondents. And we integrate that with geospatial data. And there are many forms of geospatial data that we use, right? So DHS geocovariates, but also UNDR's Global Disaster Risk Dataset and the Global Self-Consistent Hierarchical High Resolution Geographic Databases are different sets that we use for data integration. And this allows us to see a lot of connections between different gender outcomes and different, environmental variables. So in terms of pros, the survey is already available. The geospatial data is being collected regularly, right, through satellite imagery. So no additional cost, which is really good news. But the limitations are that the geospatial data is not reflective of specific events alone, in the sense that, for instance, through geospatial data, we're able to see the areas that are more prone to drought episodes, but we're not able to look at associations between one specific episode and a certain gender outcome. Like, as a result of this drought, we saw X% increase in violence against women. We're not able to look at that connection because there is a mismatch between the geospatial data and the survey data in terms of, timeliness. Another option for continuing to fill data gaps, again, is analyzing big data, like the example I was mentioning earlier around looking at violence against women in the context of disasters. The good news about analyzing big data is that big data is being generated by default when we go about our business. So it's very much an untapped source to a certain level, right? Obviously, it's good because it helps fill gaps that are otherwise difficult to fill. So for instance, in the context of violence against women, the reason why we look at big data is because it's complicated to collect violence data in a disaster setting, right? Where it's very difficult for enumerators to speak with the respondents alone and to gather kind of like accurate information. While, we can just tap on the big data and at least get the signals. We are never going to be able to get accurate prevalence information from big data, but we can at least get signals of what might be happening. The drawbacks, of course, is that there is a bias. We're only looking at the experience of internet users, for instance, if we're looking at Google search data. And also, we need to take the accuracy of online information with a grain of salt, right? We don't know if what people are Googling are really what they're feeling. And obviously, there is a lack of consent in the sense that when you carry out a survey, you're actually asking the respondents to give consent to carry out the survey. But in the context of big data, you're just assuming that if people are putting their information on the internet, then you could use it. And then finally, of course, we can leverage administrative data, right? Administrative data generally generated by, firms, by governments, by registries, and so on. If registration systems are in place, this is the most cost-effective form of data collection because there are institutions that are in charge of just, gathering this data and registering this data. However, the registries are not necessarily full encompassing and therefore not necessarily representative, for instance, of the people that are illegal immigrants or they are homeless and so on. They are often left out of some of this registration, right? In addition, it has limited reach in the sense that, for instance, if we're looking at who participates in decision-making, administrative data might be very well placed to give us information about, decision-making among politicians, among ministers, among government officials, but perhaps not so much among, people participating in the private sector, in different environmental-related firms. There are also issues with accessibility and timeliness sometimes with administrative data.
Sarah?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I think we're running out of time.
Okay, well, this is my last slide.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. So finally, the last option for filling data gaps is forecasting and modeling, like I was saying earlier. So, the challenge with forecasting and modeling is that your data is only as good as your model assumptions are, right? So that means that you really need to kind of like think this through and kind of like set out your assumptions and be very clear about what you're assuming, right? Creating models is complex and it's time consuming. And sometimes it results on exercises that, international organizations kind of like carry out, but there's no ownership from the country. So in our case, we always try to do our modeling in partnership with national governments so that they can contribute to the design of the model, basically. Oh, sorry, one last slide. Apologies, I forgot about this. So there's one additional form of data, which is citizen-generated data. I haven't spoken about this at all today, but basically citizen-generated data offers a lot of opportunities for filling data gaps through applications or interface, for instance, that we have on our phone, right? And we're able to actually collect a lot of data through, contributions from citizens, which is very valuable. It's valuable because it encourages public engagement and it's very affordable. However, obviously it has limited reach and representativeness in some cases. And there needs to be an incentive for data entry. So with that, I'll stop here. Apologies that I went over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's okay. It's quite important the things you were sharing on your presentations. So we're going to pass for to our second presenter, Ruani Dharmakirti. So Ruani is Senior Gender Program Officer at IUCN. She focused primarily on supporting the Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Environment Grants Challenge. This initiative funds projects dedicated to addressing gender-based violence in environment and climate-related programs and generates new information and learning that help enrich the knowledge base of GBF environment linkages. Riani is going to help us understand what is the implementation of Objective 1.5 of the Gender Plan of Action of the CBD. So, and before you start, Rani, I want to also request our participants, if you have any comments or any questions, please do share it in the chat. You can share it in Spanish, in French. We have interpreters that can help us translate it in English, so please do it. And Rani,
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Alejandra, and thank you so much to the Women for Biodiversity team for inviting me today and for hosting this really important session. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ruani Dharmakirti, and I'm a Senior Gender Program Officer with the Human Rights and Conservation team at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, as Alejandra shared earlier. Today, I'm going to talk about IUCN's work over the past 5 years on gender-based violence and environment linkages, and how the generation of knowledge and data at this intersection helped inform the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Gender Plan of Action and created the first and only funding mechanism at the intersection of addressing gender-based violence in environment and climate contexts. Next slide, please. Before I begin, please note that this presentation does discuss gender-based violence, and I do urge you to take care. Next slide. Thank you. In 2020, with the support from USAID, IUCN published a global study on gender-based violence and environmental linkages. And what we found is that gender-based violence is used to negotiate and reinforce existing privileges and power imbalances in access and control of land, natural resources, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. These dynamics are exacerbated in the face of environmental stressors and threats, from biodiversity loss to climate change impacts to extractive activities. We also found that gender-based violence is used to shape and control environmental work and environmental defense. Next slide, please. On the screen here, you will see a few of many examples on the ways that concurrent environmental crises can exacerbate gender-based violence. I won't dive into every example on the screen, but we can draw linkages between gender-based violence threats and risks in relation to natural resource collection, use, and management. We can also see that conflicts can arise out of established gender norms on who has the right to make decisions about these natural resources, especially when climate stress worsens the quality and availability of biodiversity resources. And we can see that gender-based violence is used to silence and threaten defenders who work to protect nature from biodiversity degradation and climate impacts. Next slide, please. The knowledge and data generated in IUCN's publication helped inform the CBD Global Plan of Action Objective 1.5 that aims to identify and eliminate, prevent, and respond to all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence, in particular in relation to control, ownership, and access to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, including protecting women environmental human rights defenders and park rangers. The indicative actions suggested for the implementation of this objective include developing and deploying data, tools, and strategies to understand and address gender-based violence and biodiversity linkages, which is what IUCN has been working on since the launch of the publication in 2020. particularly through the Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Environments, or RISE Grants Challenge. Next slide, please. The RISE Grants Challenge also contributes to Target 23, focused on ensuring gender equality and gender-responsive approaches to biodiversity action. In particular, this target focuses on women and girls' equal rights and access to land and natural resources, and their full, equitable, meaningful, and informed participation and leadership at all levels of action, engagement, policy, and decision-making related to biodiversity. Related to this target, we do have a few RISE projects that address gender-based violence related to land rights, including a new project in Kenya that will address gender-based violence linked to tenure rights violations as a result of carbon credit projects gaining increased traction in Kenya. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about the RISE Grants Challenge. The RISE Grants Challenge was created in response to our research findings, as I mentioned earlier, and RISE is focused on providing funding and technical support to environmental programs to learn about gender-based violence linkages and work to address them. It was created by USAID in 2019 as a result of IUCN's research findings, and IUCN took the helm, running our first call in 2022. And in late 2023, NORAD joined the grant-making basket to help us scale efforts. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the screen, the demand for support is enormous and has, multiplied every round. Last year was the first year that we actually reduced the number of countries, and we still received 741 applications. So our goal is to work with grant winners to develop learning for global policy and practical application while contributing to preventing harm and fostering inclusive and equitable conservation and climate action. Next slide, please. Today, the RISE Grants Challenge is now a family of 18 projects, which have worked to address gender-based violence and wildlife conservation, indigenous managed forestry, fisheries, mining, among other sectors. And we currently have 9 active projects across sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, including a cohort of 4 new projects that started implementation this year. Next slide, please. And to date, over 100,000 people have been reached via RISE projects on the ground. Last year alone, we had 5 projects that trained over 1,000 people on gender-based violence and environment linkages and conducted awareness-raising activities that reached more than 5,000 people. And past RISE rounds have worked with more than 15,000 people and reached almost 100,000 people through project outreach and engagement. And just as a snapshot of some examples of the policy influence, you can see a couple photos here of some of our grantees as well as communities. There's a photo of Trang Nguyen, a RISE 2019 winner with Vice President Kamala Harris, helping launch the US government's WISE initiative on women in sustainable environments in late 2023. You can see Samantha Munagandu outside the Zambian parliament the day she presented RISE learning on gender-based violence to the government. You can see Dr. Elizabeth Imti at COP28 giving testimony to global leaders, as well as a woman ranger speaking up and out with the support of RISE leaders like Joyce Peshu from KWCA. Next slide, please. So RISE projects continue to generate results, which we share through our website. In Zambia, RISE projects in a current project have innovated community-driven gender-based violence referral services to remote fishing camps, where seeking help requires walking 8 hours. In Mexico's protected areas, RISE grantees increased safety perceptions of women ecotourism providers by 33%. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the number of women reporting sexual coercion to participate in mining reduced by half in the target community, and sexual harassment dropped from 32% to 19%. In Peru, indigenous women, forestry stewards from the RISE project formed an all-female community patrol and urged the government to train the other patrols made up of mostly men on how to respond to gender-based violence reports from community members. And in a wildlife project, a focal point system was created acting as trainers and support providers to address sexual assault and harassment in wildlife work. The RISE Grants Challenge has also supported its cohort organizations to improve institutional capacities. For example, through RISE, organizations have hired full-time gender staff for the first time, with these positions having been sustained after the closing of RISE projects. Also through RISE, environmental organizations have created brand new or improved existing sexual harassment and abuse policies, grievance and redress mechanisms, and safeguarding policies to respond to the challenges of gender-based violence. And I'll also add that the RISE family has been growing its policy influence from helping launch, inform, or influence major national policy processes and global initiatives to influencing global environmental finance mechanisms, to contributing to global biodiversity policymaking and advocating at national levels. We've worked with both past and current RISE winners to effect change. And as I mentioned earlier, RISE is the only dedicated mechanism to implement CBD 1.5. RISE winners have helped national and municipal governments revise policies related to addressing gender-based violence in environmental contexts. As I mentioned earlier, Samantha was standing in front of the Parliament presenting on gender-based violence in the fisheries sector, and that project is now helping to inform the Fisheries Act in Zambia. Next slide, please. So through RISE, we're learning a lot, and behind the scenes, we're working to distill experiences and tools. You can see here a preview of some of the learning we are analyzing, and what we've found through RISE is that engaging men is crucial to changing harmful gender norms and behaviors. In Kenya, where physical and psychological violence is used to maintain a culture where women can't engage in conservancies, KWCA's work with partners to engage men as champions has been key to changing conservancy policies, to increase women's inclusion and leadership. We've also found that creating safe spaces for women and men to discuss gender-based violence facilitates a safe space for reflection and change. Community-based planning, including working with traditional leaders, developing community safety plans, and working through community structures is also critical for addressing gender-based violence. For example, in Mexico, ECHO and World Wildlife Fund Mexico have been developing community safety plans to improve safety from sexual harassment for women in protected area ecotourism. It's also imperative that organizations champion institutional change to ensure that safeguards are in place to do no harm. And finally, encouraging environmental organizations to build relationships with gender-based violence referral pathways has been critical for responding to disclosures. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to leave you with a few of our recommendations. And a lot of these recommendations have actually been highlighted by previous speakers today, but I'll stick to the script for right now. We, of course, encourage strengthening normative, legal, and regulatory frameworks, national and international framework processes that recognize gender-based violence and violence against women and girls, and climate change linkages can help to inform and support other governmental and international policy spheres to recognize the linkages. Integrating gender perspectives into climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, cross-sectoral knowledge sharing and collaboration across areas of expertise on addressing gender-based violence and violence against women and girls and climate change can help to build and enhance capacities to address interlinkages. Expanding gender-responsive finance, investing in cross-sectoral partnerships, building among climate change and GBV prevention response grassroots organizations, advocacy groups, institutions, and practitioners. Of course, enhancing gender statistics and data. And I think as Kiara mentioned, disaggregated data by sex, generating data and information on GBV and climate change linkages to uncover potential mitigation, prevention, and response strategies. And finally, fostering a gender-responsive just transition by protecting and promoting safe and inclusive working environments free of violence and discrimination against women and girls in climate change-related sectors in the context of a just transition. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. And of course, I'll stick around to answer any questions. And I've also left our RISE email address here in case you ever want to get in touch. Thanks. Over to you, Alejandra.
Thank If you have any question, any comment, you can start. So I'm gonna give the National Biodiversity thank you so much.
Hello everyone. I think Alejandro was kind of breaking up in between, so I don't know if it is my connection or on Alejandro's side, but let me just figure out the presentation that I want to give. Should be.
Mr. Wangchuk, if it's becoming difficult, I can also share the presentation.
Shouldn't be a problem actually.
Okay.
I
Okay.
should.
All right.
All right. So can everyone see my presentation?
Not yet. Now we can.
And without the
Yes, without the notes.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where everyone's joining us from. Again, goes without saying, wonderful presentations, both Sarah and Ruvani. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Women for Biodiversity for organizing this important event and including us. It's my honor to share perhaps not so much of the data and the statistics on gender, but perhaps Bhutan's story and the journey so far in developing the NBSUP and how we've gone about integrating gender, particularly the gender perspective into our new NBSUPs. As we all know, biodiversity conservation is not just about protecting nature, it's also about empowering the community that rely on it. In Bhutan, we recognize the role that women play, and it's very, very essential in managing natural resources, leading community efforts, and ensuring sustainable practices. That is also why it was so crucial for us to include not just specific targets on gender, but also gender-specific actions and strategies within our NBSUPs. So in the next 10 to 12 minutes, hopefully, provided I have time, I'll be sharing the story and the approach that we took to integrate gender into our NBSUP planning. Without taking a lot of time, I think the introduction has already been completed. So I'm Karmochu. I work for the National Biodiversity Center in Bhutan, and I'm also the coordinator for developing Bhutan's next NBSUP. Again, I have to be very honest, it's quite intimidating for me as I'm not an expert or a gender specialist. Instead, my role is that of a coordinator, which primarily involves, mobilizing resources and, managing stakeholders and particularly, bringing on board the right kind of people. And during this process, I've had the honor of working with some remarkable and passionate individuals who are deeply committed to the work of gender issue. But please bear in mind, I'm still learning. This has been a very steep learning curve for me, particularly when it comes to gender. So whatever I share today comes from my experiences, very little experiences of what I've learned about gender and how to incorporate them within the NBSUP. If at any point in time I happen to sound insensitive, please bear in mind and understand that it's only because I'm still on this learning path, and I sincerely appreciate your patience. All right, so right to the point, Bhutan, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a very small country up in the Eastern Himalayas, and the picture that you see on the screen is pretty much how we look. Everything is pretty much the mountains. We are around 770,000 people, more or less, and a country with a huge conservation commitment and large conservation ethos. I think we are one of the few countries in the world where environmental and biodiversity conservation is actually embedded in the constitution. So yeah, huge and very great conservation commitments. Now let's look at some important data and statistics into Bhutan. So the presentation is structured such that I will be briefly talking about gender data at the national level, and then the gender and statistics and the numbers within the NBSOP formulation team. And then I'll talk about the NBSOP, talk about the gender data within the NBSOP document itself. So let's look at the national level. Of the 770,000 people, roughly around 48% are women at 369,000 people, roughly. So close to about 48%. Women's participation in Bhutan, particularly in the agriculture sector, is significant. It's around 63.2% of the workforce in rural agriculture is represented by women. So a huge contribution and a huge role. Now let's look at how these numbers look within the NBSOP formulation team. I've talked about some really key statistics at the national level. Let's look at how Bhutan's NBSOP structure and looks like, and how the gender data looks like in terms of that structure. So this is the NBSOP task force, or you can call it the NBSOP team. At the top, we have the two co-chairs. We have the NBSOP secretariat where I work. And then we have the task force members from various organizations, government, non-government, and each of them bearing specific and unique portfolio and domain expertise. We again tried to bring together as dynamic team as possible for this formulation team. So we have people from across environment, water, agriculture, forest, livestock, and even education and women and children. So let's look at how the gender data or representation looks like. We've ensured that there has to be, or there is, a systemic and structural representation of women within the NBSOP formulation team. So for us, gender equality and representation of women actually start at the very top. And I'm talking about the co-chairs. One of the co-chairs, who's also my boss, is a woman. So there's a 50% representation there. And then we have the NBSOP secretariat. There are two of us working there, and one of them is not a woman. So again, 50% representation there as well. All right, so now let's look at the technical working force, or we call them the National Task Force member for the development of NBSOPs. Around 45% of the technical working group is represented by women. So not quite as much as the 50% mark, but not bad indeed. Again, I have to stress on this. None of the above representation even comes close to what, in my opinion, and what I consider the greatest accomplishment for Bhutan and the NBSOP team in terms of mainstreaming gender component within the Bhutan next to NBSOP. And that is by including a permanent member from the National Commission for Women and Children within the National Task Force member. She's an incredible colleague of mine, and I've grown quite fond of her in the past year or so that we've been together developing the NBSOP. And again, in my opinion, this is a significant accomplishment. With the gender specialist on board within the National Task Force, every target, every strategy, every action, and every indicator now goes through a gender lens. And I feel like that's quite commendable, and a huge accomplishment in terms of making our NBSOP more inclusive and gender friendly. And Her name is Ms. Shishe, the gender specialist. She makes sure that there are regular sessions, familiarization and sensitization programs for not just the technical workforce member, but also for other participants. So in this process of developing the NBSAP, we've had 7 national level broader stakeholder consultation. And, in all those consultations, meetings and participations, we've seen that around close to 45% of the participants have been women. So we're doing not so bad in terms of number and, gender statistics. Now let's look at how gender and those data look within the our new NBSAP strategy document itself. Or you can also say, well, how gender friendly is your NBSAPs? So we have nationalized from the GBF global targets, which are 23, we've nationalized 20 national targets within the next NBSAPs. And we have one target specifically aligning with the global target 23, and ours is target 15. So within our NBSAP, we have one specific target on gender, and that is to ensure gender equality and gender responsive approaches within biodiversity action. We have another target, national target 3, which is indirectly or partly complementing the gender component, and that is inclusive participation in decision making. So we have 2 of our national targets within the NBSAP that directly or indirectly link with the gender issues. There's another way to look at it, how gender friendly is your NBSAP? So what's your gender friendly score? And for this presentation, I kind of had to do this rough and a very crude analysis. And out of the 20 targets within our NBSAP, 2 of them relate to gender. So that's about 10% of our NBSAP targets are directly and contributing or on the gender issue. 4 strategies within the NBSAP relate to gender, which accounts for about 8.1%. And in total, we have around 11 actions within the NBSAP that is related to gender. So we are kind of edging around close to 10%. So that's not bad. So I also did a crude and a rapid assessment of our NBSAP 20 targets just to see how we would score in terms of gender friendliness and gender inclusive languages. The word her appeared 0 times, both her and she, and the word gender actually appeared 12 times. So that's actually a very crude and a very rapid way to assess how gender friendly your NBSAP is. But if anybody's interested, this is one way to do that. This is for anyone who would like to see how gender friendly their NBSAP document is, or for that matter, any strategy document or a policy document. You can actually do this analysis yourself. You can do this quantitative analysis of gender-specific languages. You can also do a qualitative analysis of content and tone, see if they avoid any stereotypes, if it has inclusive narrative or an empowering language. You can also do the sector-specific considerations as well as contextual and cultural sensitivity, basically to look at systemic and structural representation of women. So with this, I've come to the end of my slide, and I'd like to end my presentation with this picture of the strong and powerful women working within the NBSAP formulation team. I'd like to thank all of our development partners, particularly the UNDP, and of course for this event, the hosting event, the Women for Biodiversity. For those interested to connect, this is how I appear on LinkedIn, and which actually is a perfect segue because my LinkedIn has been blowing up since the session began. I think I was linked on this session's web page. So yeah, with this, I'd like to hand the floor back to Alejandra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karma. I think now I'm not breaking Okay, but if I do, so you can support us in also addressing the question that has been raised in the chat. So thank you so much for our third presenters, to Sarah, Rani, Karma. Okay, so we have some questions here. Okay, so first question is to Miss Sarah Duerto. So how can we translate all the available forms of data to address biodiversity challenges?
Thank you so much. I think that's a very pertinent question, and it's not exactly easy to answer. It's true that so many times, like we have data, but the data just sits there and it doesn't actually translate into change on the ground. So I think it's a very important question. So in the environment, there are several approaches that we take to try to promote the use of this data, right? The first and most important one, I think, is that we have a connection between the users and the producers of the data. So before we even go out to the field to, for instance, roll out a gender and environment survey, we actually have a discussion with the potential users of the data, right? So we have a discussion with different representatives from different government offices, different ministries, civil society organization, and so on, to assess what are the information needs in the country. And that helps us adjust the survey questionnaire so that we can then ask the questions that are most relevant to that particular context, right? That by default just increases the likelihood of the data being used afterwards, because we're really collecting the information that people wanted to have. But besides kind of like the relevance of the information, I think even sometimes when we have data that's very relevant, it doesn't really translate into data use necessarily. So I think there are different approaches that we follow. The first one, we're careful about the format in which we release the data, right? Not everybody's a statistician, and we cannot assume people are going to find the data from a survey and be able to analyze it, right? So producing different products which highlight the data in different ways, I think is important to speak to different audiences. I think making the ties to specific national policies is also very important. So if we know that a national development strategy or a national action plan on biodiversity or on the environment, right, includes certain mentions of certain gender issues, we try to produce data that responds directly to those issues, right? If the national action plan also has indicators, then we try to produce data that directly informs those indicators, for instance. And sometimes existing policies actually do not cover some of the new and emergent issues in a certain country, right? So I'll just give you an example. I was in a country, and I won't mention the country, earlier this week, right? They have a huge issue with mass die-offs of fish as a result of pesticides. And everybody's talking about it, right? It's a very new thing for them, right? But there's absolutely no data. And the women that rely on those fish are really suffering because it's very difficult for them to change fishing locations. So, producing data quite urgently about what is happening exactly can really help the government make decisions to change that, right? So I think that, sometimes seizing the opportunity of like speaking to the emerging issues is very important to promote data use. And finally, another important thing I find that's typically useful is to bring the data to the communities, right? Sometimes we work so hard on producing the survey data and generating the estimates. But rather than just posting them online or working with the government, I think it's also very useful when we bring the data to the communities and we hear their feedback on the data, whether it resonates, whether it doesn't, what solutions they propose to kind of address the issues that have been highlighted by data. We find that when we do that, then the likelihood of the policies being put in place at the central government level being more impactful is higher. So I think there's just, a combination of possible approaches to make sure the data gets used. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sierra. I want to highlight a comment here made in the chat from Sierra Danas. She said, can you share in the chat the data resources outside of ones from your own organization that you constantly turn to? So if you have any data you're using right now, just please add it in the chat so we can all be informed of this new source of data that we're all working on. So I have a question to Ms. Ruani. Well, actually, there's two questions. So the first one is, what has been the response from national governments towards RISE? And the other one is, how is RISE work related in the implementation of the CBD Gender Plan of Action? Thank you so much, Rani.
Sure. So let me tackle the second question first. So as I mentioned during my presentation, Objective 1.5, which directly is looking at gender-based violence, especially in the context of biodiversity and protecting women, environmental human rights defenders and park rangers. And the actions that are indicative of this objective is to, of course, deploy data, tools, strategies to understand and address gender-based violence. So what IUCN has done is the gender-based violence and environmental linkages study, which was published in 2020. And out of that, the RISE Grants Challenge was created. And the RISE Grants Challenge directly addresses this objective, as the entire point of the Grants Challenge is to address the intersection of gender-based violence and environment linkages. So all of the projects that we fund through the RISE Grants Challenge are all focused on addressing gender-based violence and environmental and climate contexts. So that's how the RISE Grants Challenge directly, is related to that. And then for the first question, which was the reaction of governments to RISE, I think we've had, for the most part, good reactions. As I said, I have the example of Zambia, where our implementing partner, ActionAid and YWCA, they conducted a gender analysis. And as one of the other speakers mentioned, it's quite difficult to directly have, especially environmental organizations that don't have as much experience working on gender-based violence, to do something like a GBV risk assessment without the expertise. So what we do is we require all organizations to do a gender analysis. And within that, we ask them to ask proxy questions related to safety, how safe people feel engaging in environmental actions or activities. And from that, we generate a lot of information and data that, covers that intersection. For example, in Zambia, the project actually presented the findings to the parliament. The Fisheries Act that existed, of course, addressed women's participation and inclusion in the fisheries sector, but didn't necessarily address safety issues that intersect in the fisheries sector. So from the findings, I think the government received the information really well and actually encouraged ActionAid and partners to participate and inform the next version of the Fisheries Act. So we've had some really good uptake from the information that's being generated through projects at the government level. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rani, for addressing both questions. And then we have questions. What has been the role and responsibilities for technical working group member looking at women and children? And yeah, I can, okay, so that question will be okay, Karma, then I'll find the other one and make you the other question we have for you.
All right, Alejandro, thank you so much for that excellent question. So the role of the technical working group member from the Women and Children's Commission is, in principle, to carefully review and assess and scan each of our national targets, strategies, and actions through a gender lens to see, if the gender roles, if the gender concerns have been addressed in each of those targets. And, if I can share you an example, I know my colleague from the TWG member, technical working group member, is also attending. She's also here in this event. If I can maybe share a small example of we were talking about, we were negotiating on a national target and strategies related to capacity building. And capacity building can take many forms, that institutional capacity building for enhancing or strengthening conservation efforts. Now that target is specifically on, creating an enabling environment and building your capacity, national capacity of Bhutan. However, I think one example, if I can share, is, there was a negotiation and recommendation for inclusion of creche, right? And that's a very important, if you think about it, in terms of capacitating and creating an enabling environment, uh, it perfectly fits into this description of enabling women in different structures within the conservation and environmental protection roles to effectively contribute towards conservation, because they will not, or they will no longer be bothered or disturbed by this thing that they have to otherwise take care of. So a lot of negotiations in these workshops, and our gender focal is very, very busy all the time negotiating the terms and negotiating areas where the gender components can be addressed. But I know that was a rather long answer, but a short answer is to ensure that each of the targets, strategies, and actions within our NBSAPs is actually scanned and reviewed through a gender lens to make it more gender inclusive and gender friendly. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I got the second question.
Yeah, and the second question is, there's so much data seen, but what are the challenges parties face in using this data, especially in designing gender-responsive MBSAPs?
Yeah, I think excellent question again, but the answers are going to be, very different from what Sarah just answered. I think, a lot of effort has been put in. Data has become more and more visible now, especially within Bhutan. Our National Statistics Bureau has put in a lot of effort, and the quality of the data, or the effort that is being put into generating those data has really improved. However, the next step, or the way forward, or you can also describe that as a challenge that we have right now, is to effectively utilize this data. As Sarah mentioned, all that data, if it's just sitting out there and not translating into those gender specific actions into the policies, they are of no good. So the next way forward for us is definitely to make better utilization of those data, and of course strengthening our data generating and capacity, trying to fill up those gender gaps. In fact, our national target on gender, a few of the actions within those targets are actually generating more gender specific data, particularly in areas where there are a lot of gender specific data gaps. Yeah. I hope I answered that question.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Karma. Yes, you did clarify the question. So before taking the last three questions made and giving you the to 84, can you please, 84, share your question or comment? I'll give you the floor now.
Okay, thank you very much, my colleagues. And is there any accountability for setting targets for NBSAP targets, or especially gender specific aligning targets for nationally or internationally by CBD or NBSAP coordinators? Is there any accountability? Countries that setting targets aligning with target unitary on NBSAP, and the implementation is not meaningful. For example, in Ethiopia, is there any accountability for CBD or NBSAP coordinators internationally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Work. So can some of our panelist speakers want to respond to this?
Hi, Ali. Let me just come in. Can
Okay.
everybody hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you. Okay.
Hi, Divo. It's lovely to see you. At least I don't know whether it is only me, but I could not hear your question clearly because the sound was not loud. So if you would want to either put it on the chat or take the floor again to make sure that we are able to answer the question would be very helpful. While I am online, I'm going to quickly take one question that I think came about from Soledad Espinola. My apologies if I'm pronouncing your name not correctly. It was around your comment around Paraguay's NBSAP national target aligned to the GBF target 23, and that the NBSAP in Paraguay actually addresses both men and women. And your question, if I understand, is how would that be really aligned to target 23? I'm also happy if anybody has any insights, including Karma, if you have, because you are working on the NBSAP. But just a quick reflection from my side on that one is that the understanding sometimes around the gender equality target, of course, is also ensuring that we ensure that everybody, the whole society, is included. One of the way that you may wish to look at whether that target is aligned with the target 23 is to also see how the elements of the national Paraguayan target responds to the gender plan of action, right? Because the gender plan of action will maybe give a guideline of certain elements or actions. And the other one also to share that though the national targets are being set up by the parties to the convention, the NBSAP national targets are not also set up by in itself. They are also to be complemented with national targets or aligning some kind of their own statistics to also respond to the headline or the component and the complement indicator in the global biodiversity framework. So there could be, so if you would want to assess that, you may want to look at some of those frameworks and actions that maybe Paraguayan has put in forth for that particular target, an indicator or an action or a policy that they're planning, which may then help whether the elements actually is responding to the to target 23. So I'm hopeful. I hope that is helpful. And because in our sphere we have Karma as an expert who's actually engaged in the national process, any insights would also be helpful. So thank you. And Etifolk, after that, please, if you can take the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tina. Yes, I want to raise okay, Etifak, let me tell you if the question you raised, it was about if there will be any accountability on NBSAPs on the gender target. Okay, so Karma, Rani, Sarah, if you can respond to this question, if there will be any accountability on NBSAPs on the gender targets.
Yeah, the question is still a little unclear to me. I'm not sure in what sense accountability. At the end of the day, I think respective party countries are responsible to monitor, to track, and to ensure that their NBSAP targets, which are aligned with the global targets, are accomplished to the best of or within the scope available. So in terms of that, I think the NBSAP Secretariat maybe has this coordination role, but at the end of the day, I think it all falls down to the coordinating and the responsible agencies. Which is why we have to, when you bring from the global targets to the national targets, we have to nationalize them. We have to look at our current context, and we have to really look at our conservation landscape. I know we are talking about the gender issue, so we really have to look at, okay, what does the global target 23 look like, and are all those issues also pertinent and relevant within the Bhutanese context? If yes, then you then go ahead and develop a national target and strategies and actions around it. If partially yes, then you really kind of have to curate your targets as per your needs, but in one way or the other that complements the global target. But however, towards the bottom, and you have to identify accountability. For our NBSAPs, we have developed, or actually we are in the process of developing an implementation plan and also a division of responsibility. All right. So for this specific target on gender, who's going to be the leading organization that will be responsible for monitoring, let's say, strategy 1, and which are the other organization and agencies that would be complementing, or they will have a coordinating role. So I don't know if I answered your question properly, but if the question is, should there be any accountability? Yes. How do you go about doing it? Is by developing a proper implementation plan and a proper division of responsibility plan. And again, it all comes down to monitoring and evaluation framework. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you very much. That's the answer.
Thank you so much, Eti Work and Karma, for addressing the question. Tina?
Yeah, sorry, Ali, we lost you there for a second. Just coming back to Ittifaq, and I also want to really acknowledge her participation, because I'm really happy that she is here, and it's also a very learning space, because she is the gender focal point for Ethiopia. And I think, Karma, thank you so much for also coming in, because I think everybody's also trying to learn and see how to really see these alignments. And I think we really also need to share how good practices and examples and how the processes can also be shared between the parties. I think that would be really very something that I think we are looking forward to seeing how we could coordinate that. And hopefully that we all get to also meet up with in Cali to discuss that. So Ittifaq, thank you so much, and I do also congratulate you for joining as the CBD gender focal point, and for the question of I think there is a learning, a challenge that everybody's also trying to do, is how do we really strengthen or embed the aspirations or the target 23, not only in itself, but also throughout the 22 targets of the KMGBF. So thank you so much for your question. And Karma, thank you so much also for your response. Ali, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you so much for all of our participants that have joined us today. I don't know if Sumina, do you want to take a group photo of the participants?
Thanks, Ali. Yes. If everybody could open their cameras, then I'll take a group photo. Okay, waiting for more people to open their cameras. It's totally fine if you don't want to. All right. On 3, 2, 1, smile, everybody. One more. Perfect. Lovely. Thank you so much. Ali, back.
Okay, so I think I'm breaking down. Minal, can you please jump in to finalize this the information session before I break down?
Sure, Ali. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, especially to the speakers. We really appreciate you taking your time and sharing such wonderful insights, especially from the work that you're doing. And we know that COP is very close, and a lot of parties, especially gender focal points, are looking for as much help as they can in working out their NBSAPs and also ensuring that the NBSAP is gender responsive. So I would just like to thank everybody, also the participants for joining, and our wonderful interpreters for doing such a great job. Thank you so much, and we will soon see you next week again with another webinar, which information we will be sharing soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.